Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about someone usually called the last pagan king of England, and why such a simplistic title is misleading. His name was Penda. Seemingly he was born about 605 and became king of Mercia in either 626 or 633, and he ruled Mercia until his death in 655. Historians think he became king of part of Mercia in 626, and only in 633 did he control the whole kingdom. And the pioneering historian Bede, writing a couple of generations later, describes Penda as a most warlike man of the royal race of the Mercians. Penda undoubtedly did not identify as Christian, but he respected other people's religions. Bede specifically states that Penda tolerated the preaching of Christianity in Mercia, and indeed there's evidence that the early 7th century Mercian elite were cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and generally tolerant. In the last 20 to 30 years, historians and archaeologists have done much to understand this pluralism during the conversion era. However, previous generations of historians, shall we say, oversimplified things, and these oversimplifications still prevail in popular accounts of that period. The underlying problem is a simple one. The study of British history shaped up during the neoclassicism of the later half of the 18th century and into the 19th century, and the classical accounts of pagans in the Mediterranean led to the assumption that pre-conversion societies in Britain were almost the same. But setting up paganism as a sort of dualism against Christianity is just an imaginary contest. Paganism is essentially a concept invented by historians, and it should not be thought of as some sort of antithesis to the early missionary church. Pre-conversion religious practices were pluralistic, and from the perspective of the time, the Christian Gospels were thought of not as a rival system, but as the culmination of what had gone before. Nevertheless, among historians, this invented notion of a simple dualism between pagan and Christian became uncritically entrenched. In the 1990s, archaeologists established that reality was nothing like such a simple dualism. And after that, historians such as David Petts and John Blair have been playing catch-up, weaving together the archaeological evidence with the more reliable historical records. Apart from creating imaginary pagans and a misleading dualism of pagan versus Christian, the leading 19th century historians made another false assumption. Now, bear in mind, these historians were based mostly at Oxford and Cambridge. Both universities required their dons to be practising Anglicans. This was specifically to exclude Catholics from learned professions such as law and medicine. Indeed, only when there was money to be made from overseas students in the 1960s did the Oxbridge colleges quietly waive the requirement to be Church of England. 19th century Christianity was, frankly, rather obsessed with sending missionaries to Africa and other colonial countries to save souls. And this obsession was, well, perhaps understandably shared by the history dons at Oxbridge. So these, and other Protestant assumptions, led to the perhaps understandable assumption that 7th century missionaries were also preoccupied by piety. But we have to set these 19th century presumptions to one side, and then read Bede. Whatever Bede's presumptions and assumptions might be, they are those of the late 7th and early 8th centuries, and, surprise, surprise, contain nothing of 19th century presumptions of piety, saving souls, and other Protestant ideologies. Well, for starters, saving souls isn't part of North European Christianity until sometime in the 10th century, although it did become a key part of funeral rites during the 11th century, and of course remained important. But saving souls simply wasn't why 7th century missionaries were doing their thing. So, if it wasn't piety, then what was motivating the missionaries? Well, on the basis of all the available evidence, it was power, influence, land, trade, and all the revenues that went with. The Roman Empire, not so long before, achieved this with military might. and now Rome was once again achieving the same ends, but with religious rites and doctrines. The only evidence, and I'm drawing here on both archaeological and historical sources, for what was going on in 7th century churches is for baptism, the Eucharist, and the veneration of saints' relics. And bear in mind, sacred relics were about as lucrative financially then as they would be until the 1530s, when Henry VIII's Reformation destroyed all such shrines, and often the monastic churches which housed some of them too. 7th century conversion was top-down. The local king was baptised, and all his subjects were then expected to be baptised, or at least identify as Christian. There was nothing fundamentally new about this. Long before conversion, every king would have had a personal take on which gods were to be venerated, and would have icons, known as wheels or staples, probably several of them, as pre-conversion religion was pluralistic. Although the technical term is henotheistic, that means worshipping one supreme deity does not deny the existence of other deities. Such written records that survive tell us about the conversion of the elite. But what was happening at the grassroots? What were the illiterate people doing? And what were the people most excluded from the surviving records doing? In other words, what were the women doing? We know that women were significant before the conversion because Bede tells us there was a midwinter festival called Moddernacht, Mother's Night. The early church neatly flipped this one around to be a feast associated with a certain baby. But there can't be a baby without a mother, or vice versa. So by simply flipping the emphasis from one to the other, there's actually complete continuity from Moddernacht to Christmas. And right to this day it is the feast of the year, one prepared by the mothers of a household for the family, even though Christmas is now often secular. But the underlying aspects of the custom remain close to pre-conversion celebrations of 2,000 or more years ago. We know that the early church had little interest in women. By the 7th century, the ideology of Christianity was male-dominated. Even when Christian burials can be identified from the 7th century onwards, the only such burials are elite males buried in or close to churches, or specifically close to the relics of the saints in those churches. Non-elite people, including all women, were buried elsewhere, seemingly in the more traditional cemeteries towards the periphery of settlements. This does not make those peripheral cemeteries specifically pagan. There's more than enough evidence that a diversity of funeral rites were being performed in any given cemetery, well before and after the conversion era. In the 7th and 8th centuries, funeral rites were much more statements of social status, or lack of, rather than of religious affiliation. Archaeology just simply doesn't tell us very much about non-elite people during the 7th and 8th centuries. But it tells us enough to confirm that by and large people were doing what they'd always done, keeping to the same sort of rites, but just changing the names of protective guardians, just was the way they always had been doing things. Many of these protective guardians were place-specific, so if, for example, when a woman married, she would move to her husband's settlement where the rites would be fairly familiar, but the names of the local guardians may well have been different. And that means Anglo-Saxon women were adept at honouring different guardians when they were in different places. We can reasonably assume that Anglo-Saxon women were, shall we say, multi-faith. Adding Christ to the options would be no big deal. After all, it was not about belief. Before the Reformation, and still remaining so in Roman and Eastern denominations of Christianity, religion is something performed. Thinking of religion as being about beliefs is purely Protestant, so only since the 16th, 17th centuries. In traditional societies such as India and China, there isn't a word which corresponds to the English word religion. Their words, such as puja and shenda shekjo, translate as customary practice. And indeed, when Chinese people needed to translate English religious texts into Chinese, they had to invent a new word to translate religion. Their word, zongjiao, translates as sectarian doctrine, which in my opinion is a rather enlightened exonym for religion. I digress. Just as with India and China, Anglo-Saxon religion was also about custom and practice. Based on ethnographical parallels, these traditions would almost certainly have been passed down principally from mother to daughter and granddaughter. Yup, total contrast with the male-dominated priesthood of Christianity. The women just kept on doing pretty much what they'd always been doing, with an extra prayer to Jesus or the founding saint of the local church as a bit of, shall we say, belt and braces. Not only did the rites remain similar from place to place, but the underlying reasons remained the same across quite large cultural areas. This continuity of underlying reasons is very clear from Bede. Well, it's very clear once you spot there's a big omission in his otherwise fairly detailed account of the conversion. Nowhere in his ecclesiastical history of the English nation does he ever describe what the pre-conversion religious practices were, which means they were, to all intents and purposes, the same as those of the early church. Which makes perfect sense. People simply wouldn't readily convert to a religion which didn't seem like a religion because it was doing totally different things. It was Ronald Hutton who spotted this, shall we say, silent continuity when writing about the Druids in Gaul. Tacitus describes the sacrifices by the Gauls as more barbaric than those of the Romans. But he doesn't say that the reason for the sacrificial rites was different. So, as Hutton astutely noted, we can assume that at that time, Northern Europe and Mediterranean Europe were doing rituals for essentially the same reason, which, in essence, was bribing the deities to be helpful to humans, usually bribing via intercessory beings rather than direct to the big deities. And these same intercessionary beings, the pre-Christian guardians of place, such as the genii loci and tribal ancestors, are the direct precursors to the intercessionary saints of the conversion era, who were the priest who founded a specific church. In Old Irish, the word earlam is used for both pre-conversion spiritual guardians and post-conversion saints performing the same role. There's also a continuity in the relationship of humans and gods. Early Christianity is very much focused on the Gospels rather than the Old Testament, and the Gospels are about a God, Jesus, who walks this earth. Jesus is an immanent deity, just like North European and Romano-Greek deities. But unlike the transcendent deities of Semitic religions, such as Judaism, we can reasonably assume that there was a continuity of places where a society traditionally went to get right with the gods, places of spiritual power that were also the symbolic places of power for a society. In the same way, Westminster Abbey is more than just a church where the British monarchs get married, crowned or mourned. It can be difficult to identify continuity of places of worship from the pre- to post-conversion period, not least because the church will be surrounded by generations of later burials, which destroy much of the evidence for pre-Christian activity. St Mary in Arden near Market Harbour and Great Bowden in Leicestershire is one of the few examples where sufficient pre-Christian finds have been discovered during grave digging, so archaeologists are confident that this has been a place of power for at least 3,000 years. Another example of such continuity is the location of an Anglo-Saxon church at Vernum, straddling the Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire border. The church had been demolished by the 17th century, but strap ends recovered by a metal detectorist in the 1980s can only have come from an early churchyard. What is really significant is the name. Vernum translates as the great or especially sacred Nemeton, and Nemeton is the word Romans used to refer to sacred groves. And there can be little doubt that these nemeta were in use during the Iron Age and perhaps before. How big was a great sacred grove? We know that the ring of 8 parishes surrounding the place where 2 Roman roads, one of them the Fosse Way, cross over each other, remained as a single unit of land until around the 8th or 9th century. That crossroads became the meeting site of Goscott 100 around the 10th century, but was plausibly a meeting site long before. So I suspect that the Vernemeton was centred on this crossroads, and the grove included all the 8 parishes, which conveniently form a plateau of land just above the 300-foot contour line. Vernum might have been just where all the pre-conversion counterparts to bishops got together from time to chinwag. Why do I say that? Well, Julius Caesar refers to the Druids in Gaul getting together from time to time at a place thought central to the whole of Gaul. This central place was in the territory of the Carnutí, between the Seine and the Loire. It most likely was the precursor to Chartres Cathedral. Assuming their British counterparts also felt the need to meet at a central place, then doing so at the Great Central Grove, Vernum, seemed to be entirely reasonable. After all, bishops continued the same practice with synods at abbeys and cathedrals. So, while I cannot prove it, presumably this great sacred grove was in use until at least the conversion of Mercia, after Penda's death in 655. Even the early church that I mentioned is on the periphery of those parishes, not in the centre. And such a regionally and presumably nationally important pre-conversion ritual site would have had a formal guardian, just in the same way as the British monarch is always deemed to be the defender of the faith. We even know the Old English term for such shrine guardians. They were almonds. Al is a type of shrine, and mund here is in the early sense of protection. So, an almond, a shrine protector, was a precursor to a church warden. And bear in mind that words warden and guardian are just two variants of the same original word. Almond survives in the English surname Almond and also in St Achmund, and the patron saint of at least 3 churches in Derbyshire and Lincolnshire. But they commemorate King Almond, who was killed around the year 800. Well, what was an earl? Well, what we really know is one of 4 words Anglo-Saxons used to refer to sacred sites. Wheel and stapel have the sense of shrine, but specifically imply icons, with staples being significantly bigger than wheels. Then there are harrows. Once thought to be temples, archaeologists have long since revealed that harrows were large open-air gathering places, which had been used for religious activities since the Iron Age and throughout the Roman era. All we can usefully say about earls is they're not wheels, they're not staples, and they're not harrows. So were earls smaller than harrows? I thought so until recently. But what did the Anglo-Saxons call what the Romans had called nemetons, or correct plural is nemeta, the sacred groves in use since the Iron Age? Nemeta are a poor fit for harrows, but plausibly became known as earls. As such, they're likely to be bigger than harrows. Harrows seem to be around 100 hectares, 250 acres. Nemeta seem to have been significantly bigger. And so, presumably, Vernum, the great sacred grove, was one of the biggest of all the nemeta. If Old English earl corresponds to the Latin nemeton, and there isn't another Old English word which fits, then by the 7th century the place known to the Romans as Vernum was one of the biggest of the earls, and would have needed a powerful almond as its guardian. Bear in mind Vernum is situated close to the centre of the original Mercian kingdom, as King Penda must have been the principal almond of Vernum. OK, he probably delegated the day-to-day responsibilities to one or more other folk, but I can't help but think that when he was appointed King of Mercia, the person leading the ritual would have been the local head of religious activities, quite likely the actual almond of Vernum. And Penda would very likely have been required to swear an oath, on an oath ring or symbolic sword or whatever, that he would defend the faith, which means he had sworn to defend the great sacred grove. And remember what Bede said about Penda. He despised people who didn't stick by their own belief systems. Had Penda converted to Christianity, he would have become an oath-breaker in the eyes of the followers of the pre-conversion faith, and not just any old oath, but one fundamental to those followers' society. And that fits well with what Bede tells us about Penda. Nor did King Penda obstruct the preaching of the word among his people, the Mercians, if any were willing to hear it, but on the contrary, he hated and despised those whom he perceived not to perform the works of faith, when once they received the faith, saying they were contemptible and wretched, who did not obey their God, in whom they believed. Several of the elite males in Penda's court were married to Christian wives. That means they had one or more priests in their entourage, and presumably had some sort of shrine to perform Christian rites. Just as Penda himself would have had religious leaders in his court who could construct and maintain shrines to pre-conversion deities. Now, after Penda's death, his son Penda ruled part of Mercia, and within a year Penda had converted to Christianity. But this seems to have been part of political manoeuvring to follow in his father's footsteps rather than any religious zeal. Nevertheless, the Diocese of Mercia was founded in the same year, 656, with the first bishop based at Repton. However, after 13 years, in 669, the bishopric moved to Lichfield, and in 691 the Diocese of Mercia became the Diocese of Lichfield, and there's been a diocese based in the city ever since. One of the first new churches in the Diocese of Mercia was at Bredon-on-the-Hill. This was founded about 675 on the site of an Iron Age hill fort known as the Bulwarks. The development of Christianity in Mercia in the 8th century will be a topic for a future video. But for now, a benediction for the life of Mercia's last pre-conversion guardian of the Great Sacred Grove.
Gi memorian breod Sheen and Penda, Mittel Helman, on Seo Modo was a wir.